Okay, we are live. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Nikhar Bogna from Trade Promotion Council of India, and I'm delighted to see you all in today's panel discussion on carbon trade, the climate-proof export opportunity. I would also like to extend a warm welcome to our panelists, Mr. Shailendra Singh Rao, founder, Reduce, an eminent service providing company in the field of climate change and carbon asset management, Advocate Vanita Bhatter, partner, dispute resolution, environment and tax litigation, Khaitan and Company, and an advocate on record in Supreme Court. Mr. Sandeep Keswani, director, ESG, KPMG India. He has over 14 years of experience in Asia and Africa in climate change, mitigation, adaptation, and climate finance. Professor Krishna Raj, Institute for Social and Economic Change. His area of specialization is environmental economics. Professor A.L. Ramanathan, School of Environmental Science, JNU. His areas of interest include geology, hydrochemistry, biochemistry, and glaciology. And Ms. Ashwini Hingne, Senior Manager, Climate, World Resources Institute, India. She's a climate policy researcher and an economist with over a decade of experience in this field. Thank you all for joining us today. But before we dive deep into today's discussion, let me just set some context for today's webinar. The Kyoto Protocol was adopted on 11 December 1997. This is a landmark accord that acknowledged the global need to curb greenhouse gas emissions. The clean development mechanism of the protocol acknowledged the need to set the ground for the rules of trade emission and bilateral deals in a United Nations supervised marketplace. India signed the Kyoto Protocol Agreement in August 2002. The concept was even reiterated at the 2021 Glasgow COP26 Climate Summit. Carbon trading is a system which intends to make it cheaper for companies and governments to meet emission reduction targets. Putting a price on carbon emissions is one of the most cost-effective ways to meet the world's climate goals while fostering clean technology, innovation, and low carbon drivers of economic growth. There are two main categories of carbon markets: cap and trade and voluntary. Cap and trade sets a mandatory limit on greenhouse gas emissions, and organizations that exceed these limits can purchase excess allowances to fill the gap or pay a fine. Voluntary markets enable the trading of carbon credits outside of the regulatory environment. In countries like India, greenhouse gas emission is much below the target fixed by Kyoto Protocol, and so they're excluded from the reduction of GHG emissions. On the contrary, they're entitled to sell surplus credits to developed countries. India is one of the largest beneficiaries of the total world carbon trade through CDM, claiming about 31%. The country has generated approximately 30 million carbon credits, the second highest transacted volumes in the world. Today, it is also the largest exporter of carbon credits. Further, the carbon credit market in India is set for an accelerated growth, touching $10 billion over the next 2 years, according to an estimate by ICF International. Interestingly, albeit India is one of the fastest growing markets of carbon trading in the world, it does not have an efficient and transparent legal framework for trading of carbon in the market. This is imperative to unleash the true potential of carbon trading in the country, as an emission trading scheme is a market-based solution to control pollution. This webinar explains the role of carbon trading in combating climate change, what makes India one of the hottest markets for carbon trade in the world, why it needs a legislation for this, and what kind of legislation should the country draft. To kickstart the discussion, I would like to invite ISEC's Professor Krishna Raj and Mr. Shailendra Singh Rao, founder, Reduce, to explain what is carbon trading, how do carbon permits work, and what are the different ways that carbon can be priced. So first, Professor Krishna Raj from ISEC, over to you first. Then we'll come to Mr. Rao.
Thank you, Nikar, for giving me this opportunity. I'm very happy to be associated with Trade Promotion Council of India for this very good endeavor to highlight the importance of carbon trading in India. Yes, you would know climate change is the biggest challenge or threat faced by the present and future generations. Climate change refers to long-term increase in temperature and shifts in weather pattern. Already, the world's average temperature has increased by 1 degree Celsius in the last 7 decades. It will increase further by 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2040 and 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, as per the IPCC AR Assessment Report 6. So there are two important policy measures to address the climate change. One is that the climate mitigation. Another one is climate adaptation. So in order to address these two policy measures for the mitigation of climate change and adaptation, there are two policies basically. One is that command and control policy, or it is also called as direct regulation by the government through CPCB and KSPCB. And another important method available to us is that market-based or price-based or economic instruments. So among the economic instruments, there are 7 instruments available to us. One is property rights. Second one is market creation. Third one is fiscal instruments. Fourth one is charge systems. Fifth one is financial instruments. Sixth one is liability investments. And seventh one is performance bonds and deposit refund system. So this carbon trading or pricing comes under market creation, that is also called as marketable permits, and fiscal instruments such as pollution taxes, effluent taxes, emission taxes, import taxes or input taxes, product taxes, export and import taxes, tax differentiation. So the purpose of carbon pricing or trading is to reduce CO2 or greenhouse gas emission from the industrialized emissions in order to mitigate the impact of climate change. So this emission trading, as you rightly mentioned, it was under the agreement of Kyoto Protocol. The parties with commitments under Kyoto Protocol, Annexure 1 and Annexure 2 countries, have agreed the targets for limiting the emissions of carbon or reducing the emissions of carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases. So, which have to pay the cost of emissions to the developing countries, either through transfer of technology or to buying the carbon credits from the developing countries, which are still have the provision to emit more carbon dioxide because their per capita emission is much lower than the emissions of the developed countries. So these targets are expressed in levels of allowed emissions or assigned amount. So this can be expressed in terms of targets or in terms of amount. So there are 4 ways the carbon credits can be targets can be achieved. One through RMU, that is called removal of units, carbon units. Removal of units can be done through afforestation program or land use change program. And second one is ERU, emission reduction unit. This can be done through the joint implementation by the developed and developing countries through the industry, establishment of industry, which have less emissions of carbon dioxide. For example, in case of Delhi Metro and Bangalore Metro, both the metros earn carbon credits through the system where the engine develops the energy while it gets started after running into several kilometers. So the energy automatically emitted or produced. So the third one is that clean development mechanism, that is certified emission reduction. The industries can reduce the emission of greenhouse gases through energy efficiency or through limiting the use of carbon related inputs like coal or other inputs, product inputs. The fourth one is registry systems, where transfer and acquisition of these units will be maintained, or the ledger is being maintained to transfer of these emissions. So apart from this, there is an international transformation log that ensures a secure transfer of emissions reduction units between the developed and developing countries. So in short, carbon trading is the process of buying and selling the permits and credits that allow the permit holder to emit carbon dioxide to an extent, and that can be traded with the less emitting country like developing country. So there are 40 Indian companies have priced carbon so far, and there is a policy at the government level that is called PAT policy, performance, perform, achieve, and trade policy, which comes as a market-based mechanism to enhance energy efficiency in the energy intensive industries such as power and manufacturing industry like iron and steel and cement industries, fertilizer industry, and other industries. So through this process, they can sell the carbon credits they earn through reducing the emissions or enhancing the efficiency of energy, and that can be traded with the developed countries. So there are several mechanisms or methods used in pricing. That is, shadow pricing method is used, and internal certification or tax internal cap method is used, and also implicit carbon pricing method is also being used. So these types of carbon credits are being marketed in India. However, the operational part of it is dealt by other panelists. I don't want to encroach on those issues. I will come back as and when the question arises in this regard. Thank you very much.
Right. So thank you so much for sharing your perspective. I would now like to come to Mr. Shailendra Singh for his take on this question. So over to you.
Thank you, Nikhar, for inviting me for this such a informative webinar. And thank you, Professor Krishna Raj, for elaborating the nitty-gritties of the carbon credits and the technicalities. So when we talk about carbon credits, I guess a lot of talks have already been happening across the world about carbon credits and carbon markets. A lot of things have been happening globally. But we need to understand the basics of carbon credits, carbon markets, and why carbon credits are basically demanded by the actual end users, and why carbon credits are being developed by the developers, the technical reasons behind it, why carbon credits are claimed. So to understand this, we can understand it in such a manner that one carbon credit is equal to 1,000 kilogram of carbon emission reduction equivalent, CO2 emission reduction equivalent. This has been the base parameter set by UNFCCC under the CDM when the Kyoto Protocol was launched. Now there are 6 identified greenhouse gases, and the basis of all these gases, CO2 has been considered as a baseline for calculating the carbon credit. So even if you are reducing methane, even if you are abating or reducing PFC, HFC, SFC, any sort of, or N2, any sort of greenhouse gases, every gas has their own hazardous quotient. But this quotient is again compared vis-a-vis the amount of CO2. In the absence of these gases, what could have been the case scenario that is decided. Right. So, for example, if I am an owner, I am a project developer, I have installed wind power or I have installed a solar power plant. So the baseline would be that in absence of my solar power plant or wind power plant, if this much amount of clean energy would not have been generated, this energy would have been generated in a coal-based power plant, and this much amount of emission would have happened. Now, by installing this clean energy power plant, that X amount of emission my plant has replaced. That means in tune of 1 ton of carbon emission replacement is equal to 1 carbon credit. I will get these tradable permits from a particular registry. Now it depends which kind of registry I'm going to go for claiming these credits. Now there are two types of markets, as it has been elaborated earlier: compliance market and voluntary market. Compliance market is majorly cap and trade market, the CDM market governed by UNFCCC. Under CDM, you can register your project under clean development mechanism and claim the credits by following all the thorough processes. Another market which comes as voluntary carbon credits market, wherein there are different sort of autonomous voluntary registries, and these autonomous bodies have their own guidelines and parameters. Based on these guidelines and parameters, you need to get a project registered, get it audited, get it verified by approved third-party auditors, and claim the carbon credits from these registries. So you can claim credits from these both compliance and voluntary registry, and then you can sell these credits in the international market. Now, when selling the credits, who are the buyers? Now, these buyers are the obligated bodies, obligated entities, or entities which want to take a climate friendly action voluntarily. If they want to reduce their emissions to some extent voluntarily, they will go to the market and source voluntary carbon credits against the total emission done by them. So let's say there is a company which has done 50,000 tons of CO2 emission equivalent in a given year under scope 1, 2, and 3, all the processes done by it, and company wishes to achieve carbon neutrality as a part of its goal. The company would go to international market and source these credits from a suitable international project and will deal across. Now, people like carbon traders, they are basically companies like us. We are the carbon originators, developers, and traders. So we source such projects from the market. We develop such projects. We develop carbon credits, and then we talk to these international buyers, and we set up a deal between the buyers and the sellers, and we get this deal closed and get the carbon credits transferred from seller's account to buyer account. We help them getting it offsetted and let the buyer claim these credits against its own emission. Vis-a-vis, we help the payment facilitation done from buyer's side to the seller side, and the seller gets benefited with the economic value of these carbon credits. So it is basically a sustainable and economic development and sustainable development's vicious cycle, which keeps going on. Now, under all these mechanisms, be it voluntary market or compliance market, we need to understand the pricing methodology. So carbon credit is basically, whenever an investor, if it is a compliance investor, then in order to avoid its own carbon tax in its respective country, the owner would never want to pay more money in terms of carbon tax. Rather than it could go to the market and source carbon credit and get it offsetted against its own emission. That is a basic process which has been followed since years. But still, we are standing at a juncture wherein carbon pricing is still an issue for many of the buyers across the world, because carbon credit has no fixed price mechanism. Carbon credit has no fixed process by which a pricing can be done in the international market, because carbon credits, moreover, it's a subject matter of, majorly it is a subject matter of bilateral tradings. I am the seller, there is a buyer, and based on the market indicators. Now, these market indicators could be many: the total demand and supply gap of the carbon credits in the market, the total demand, because for all sort of carbon credits, EU ETS, the trading patterns of EU ETS, European Union Emission Trading Scheme, is considered as the base for setting up the pricing of voluntary carbon credits specifically. So largely it works as a base for voluntary carbon credits. So better the EU ETS perform, performing, we can consider that voluntary carbon credits will also be poised to perform better in the market. And if the trading patterns of EU ETS is going down, the international carbon market gets impacted. That's how these indicators work. Secondly, demand supply gap. If there is a more demand of carbon credits and there is a less supply comparatively in the market, so carbon credit prices will likely get increased. And if there is less demand and more supply, oversupply of carbon credits, there the prices will fall down, and which was the case earlier between the period of 2015 to 2020, when the carbon credits prices were slashed drastically due to the very lower demand across the globe. Had there been a fixed price mechanism of carbon credit, I guess the impact would have been less damaging in those times. But gladly, the situations have improved after so many years. So carbon credit pricing is largely a subject matter of bilateral trading. Mostly the prices are set and decided between the buyer and seller mutually, rather than following any particular index, rather than following any particular exchange. There have been a couple of exchanges, but these exchanges again work on the bilateral price trends in the market only. So majorly the price mechanism, there is an absence of a fixed price mechanism in the carbon markets, but carbon credits are priced largely between buyers and sellers. So that's how the trading these days are happening. There have been some talks about the proper legislation and proper framework for a decisive pricing on carbon credits, and all these things are just under discussions. Unless there is some matured, unless something concrete has been set up, I guess bilateral mode of transactions and bilateral mode of price setting will only remain the way for the carbon credits pricing. But there are certain pros and cons of this pricing method as well, because it also caters the urgency. It also largely depends on the urgency of the buyer or urgency of the seller as well. There are instances we come through these instances day in day out, wherein sellers are pushing us for selling their carbon credits at whatever price, because they are in urgent need of grabbing the money. Though we know that carbon credit prices are favorable or not favorable in the market, but if there is a seller push, we are forced to sell it at a lesser price to meet sellers' demand. Sometimes even the urgency is from the buyer side, because buyer needs to fulfill its target as soon as possible, and buyers are not getting the adequate supplies of carbon credits. Therein, buyers sometimes get ready to pay even more premium on the base prices, which is running in the market at that time, in order to get an early delivery of such credits and fulfilling its target. So both sides are there. Sometimes it's a loss for seller, sometimes it's a win-win for buyer, and vice versa. So unless there is a foolproof mechanism for carbon price setting across the globe, I guess bilateral trading is going to be the winner in the carbon trading pricing game.
Right. Thank you so much, sir, for sharing your insight. For my next question, I would like to come back to Professor Krishna Raj. And also JNU's Professor Ramanathan. Sir, I would request you to please explicate the advantages of carbon trading for entities, be them developed countries, developing countries, or even companies, and also the environment. So first, Professor Ramanathan.
Thank you for TPC for giving this opportunity. And I'm basically an environmental geologist working in the environmental science. Yeah, this carbon trading is a blessing in disguise, we can say that. Environment is already degrading because there is no option, because population is growing and then the developmental activities are carrying on. So the environmental degradation can be minimized, but I cannot say that this carbon credit will completely stop the degradation of the environment. But it will, for example, if you say that extracting the hydrocarbons and afforestation program or deforestation happening there. So there is no comparison between because millions of years it takes to store the carbon by the coal and petroleum. when the trees may be centuries to grow. And even if you have deforestation takes place, that is only 12% compared to 30 to 34% of that one. So there is no comparison between the compensation you give for this different environmental degradations. One is the deforestation and the oil exploration, for example, and coal explorations. But as having said that, but at least something is there, but something we can try to address the degradation aspect. And one more issue is there. For example, if one company talked about buyer and sellers, so the buyer may be having a lot of profit, and he keep on degrading the environment on one side, and then another buyer who is not having the money, and then he cannot. So in one way, so he is giving to somebody. There he is creating a good environment or the pristine environment. Whereas in the one area where he is rich and he is getting a lot of business, he will keep on degrading the environment. So there should be some way out between the growth, economy, and the environment. Ultimately, if you see the long term, environment is going to give us, because these are all short term. When you talk about, I talk about centuries, I talk about hundreds of years, 10 decades. So our business is, we are talking about only 10 years or 5 years, and the 5-year plan, 10-year plan. So that is what the IPCC and all this, even Gujarat now, I think the state started this carbon credit program. Other states are going to follow, and already Krishna Raj professor has explained those things. And similarly, for example, one way I will say that it is also better for the environment. For example, the degradation of mangroves. The degradation of the mangroves, which stores a lot of blue carbon. And if you give the fund to the people, it will also help the people to have the livelihood as well as store the carbon in that one. Because already the degradation is taking place by the developmental activities in the coastal area. So there is a trade-off has to be come out of this. Maybe it's only a starting one, the carbon credit. And similarly, I will also tell that with the carbon offset. So when you talk about renewable energy sources, there are positive and negatives also is there in that one. Majority of them are positive. For example, in Kayathar in Tamil Nadu, if you see that one, the windmills, the gigantic windmills have been set up there. But in one way, it is good for we are producing renewable energy and without having the greenhouse gas emission. But one way, I can think that the soil moisture is completely degrading. The agricultural activities and the vegetation part is also. So we should have some trade-off between that in that one. So wind is the very renewable energy, I always say that, but there are some 10 to 20% I can say that there is a drawback in that one. So the environment concerns are there, but we cannot grow without destroying the environment, but there should be a trade-off. So minimize the environmental degradation and then support the growth and the growth. And this is one of the way we are starting carbon trading and all those things. And this is my humble submissions to this discussion.
Right. Professor, thank you so much for your insight. Professor Krishna, over to you. What do you have to add to this?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I endorse some of the views expressed by Professor Ramanathan. Already we have reached this stage worldwide. The economic development has drastically reduced the environmental and ecosystem services, both direct, indirect use. That is especially the ecological services, carbon sequestration and water regulation and soil enrichment. It is water, rain regulation, etc. So as a result, the cost of economic development on environment has increased, As a result, environmental degradation has reached a stage behind its repair or behind its carrying capacity. So in turn, now the environmental costs are increasing and it is affecting the or limiting the economic development. For example, you look at the traffic congestion in almost all cities. So our productive hours have been lost in commuting in the cities. So the same productive hours have been used for economic development or working for economic production. So we are losing some productive hours in the traffic congestion. And second is that the wastage of resources, fuel waste, for example. We are wasting fuel, petrol, diesel, and gases every moment. So that is adding cost to the society and also to the environment cost. Apart from that, there is also health cost. So people are bearing health cost expenditure in terms of admission to the hospitals, buying medicines, undergoing treatments, and the tensions they bear out of all these things. So this is where here I am bringing a interface between economic development and environmental degradation, where they should support each other. Economic policies like carbon trading, they should support environmental improvement. On the other hand, environmental resources should support economic development or our well-being. So anyhow, as others said, the world countries after Kyoto Protocol, as you mentioned, they have come together to do something to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases. Particularly, the over emphasis has been given to carbon dioxide. So in case of carbon trading, even though there is a agreement between developed and developing countries in letter and spirit, even though there is understanding, but the spirit in which they are working towards reducing the carbon emissions is not up to the mark. So there is, yes, Mr. Sailendra has mentioned, there is no mechanism in place, there is no policy in place, there is no monitoring policy in place, there is no robust technology or robust a method to monitor the transfer or trading or exchange or permits system of the carbon dioxide emission by the various sectors or various industries. But there are some understanding between countries, bilateral understanding. And also there are at the private level, some industries are earning carbon credits. So we have conducted this study on low carbon economy in India, an assessment of energy intensive industries like power and manufacturing industries. So as per the PAT policy, PAT 1 and PAT 2, PAT policy 1 is between 2012 to 15 and PAT 2 up to 2019. So under this PAT policy, especially some of the iron and steel industry and cement industry and some coal-based industries, electricity industries, they have earned carbon credits through reducing the energy intensities. So as a result of reducing the energy intensity, or energy efficiency is being achieved as per the PAT policy. So the technology is changed and they reduce the use of inputs, and the reducing by inputs, the outputs are increased, and per unit of energy, they are producing more outputs. And the waste generated is also being reduced. The CO2 emitted is also being reduced. They have gathered some good carbon credits, but there is no market exist. So there are no buyers. So the government has not provided any mechanism to gather all these carbon credits and sell it to some developed countries. Such mechanism, in the absence of such mechanism, this policy of carbon trading, yes, I think is not successful the way we expected. So there are companies nowadays coming forward after the policy incentives have been given, especially in the renewable energy sector, solar energy, wind energy, even tidal energy, and EVs, electric vehicles, and some afforestation programs are coming. And there are some land use change programs, even private afforestation programs are being promoted. So even though there are policies for carbon trading, but the mechanism in which they exchange these carbon credits and the pricing mechanism, what would be the appropriate price for this each carbon credits earned by the industry is the problem, major issue. The second one is that the technology transfer, even developed countries have committed to provide technology required by the developing countries to reduce the carbon emissions. It is not coming forward. So under these issues or problems faced by the developing countries, on the one hand, the carbon credits are not marketed. They are not priced very well. The technology for reducing the emissions has not come forward. If the technology is there, we can earn more carbon credits and we can earn more carbon credit income. So therefore, even though the carbon credit is a very good market or price mechanism to earn the foreign income or foreign exchange reserves, the India deserves it because it is emitting less carbon dioxide per capita. So the issue is that there is no well-established carbon credit markets and well-established mechanism to trade and well-established pricing mechanism, and there are no buyers to buy the carbon credits. So this is a policy failure and also a market failure, and we can also call it as a global commons failure. The climate change is a global externality which imposes cost on the society at large, even on the poor. So the global leaders and global countries, global governments should be responsible in reducing the carbon dioxide and trade them in a better market, and this system should work. That is my idea here to say. The carbon trading, carbon pricing, and carbon investment mechanism should work in a proper way. Then only these programs are more effective. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for sharing your insights. In fact, this is something that we will also be touching upon later on towards the end of this discussion. This brings me to my next question, which is for Mr. Sandeep Keswani, Director, ESG, KPMG India, and Ms. Ashwini Hingne, Senior Manager, WRI. The value of the global carbon market increased by 20% in 2020 to US $272 billion, according to financial analysis company Refinitiv. Which countries are driving the carbon trade market, and what are the factors behind this? So Mr. Keswani, you first, and then we'll come to Ms. Ashwini.
Sure. Thank you so much, Nikha. And thank you so much for the opportunity as well to share my thoughts on this forum. So I think coming to your question about the contribution from different countries in the carbon trade market, the European Union has definitely been one of the major contributors, from the country's perspective about the carbon markets, and this has been because they're definitely one of the leaders in when it comes to proactiveness in the climate change domain. And we've discussed about voluntary carbon markets and compliance carbon markets. So European Union has, for quite some time had a emission trading scheme in place for more than a decade now, and they've had a chance to, mature their markets over this time. And it's a very vibrant market now, having been in operation for so many years. The European Union has very stringent targets around climate change. They have a Fit for 55 program in which they're looking at reducing emissions by 55% by 2030 and becoming net zero by 2050. So this puts a big amount of some sort of a very ambitious goal for the companies and the various stakeholders within these European Union countries. That is really driving a lot of action in that part of our world. And apart from this, when you talk about the compliance market programs, I think America would also be one of the bigger contributors to this market. They don't have a national scheme per se, but they do have some regional trading mechanisms like the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative and the Western Carbon Initiative as well, the WCI markets. So these have definitely been contributing in a big way to the growth of the global carbon markets. And looking at the other side of things, apart from this compliance market, we have the voluntary carbon markets. And I think if you look at there, the voluntary carbon market might be smaller in share as compared to the total market, but then it's still very vibrant and has picked up significantly in the past few years, especially in the absence of very stringent kind of goals and our Paris Agreement taking time. The Paris Agreement has been sort of discussing how to operationalize carbon markets for quite some time, and so the countries were struggling to actually put this in place in a way which sort of satisfied the requirements of all the stakeholders involved. So it took us quite some time to operationalize the requirements of the market mechanism under the Paris Agreement. But now we finally have in COP26 last year in Glasgow, we did have an agreement on how to move forward with the Article 6, and definitely a lot of action is going to pick up from that side. But in the meantime, the voluntary carbon markets have played a big role in growing this market further. And countries like China and India have again contributed significantly to this growth as well. And so if you look at India, we've got the voluntary carbon markets picking up quite well. There are even discussions around moving to setting up of a national market. So that will, I think, definitely improve the scenario even further. But when you asked about the factors that have been driving this entire growth of these markets, it's primarily because the way these markets are envisaged is that it has to work on the market economics. So it makes sense for us to reduce emissions in developing countries, where it is cheaper to reduce 1 ton of CO2 maybe as compared to reducing the same 1 ton of carbon dioxide in a developed country like Europe or America, for example. So in this way, the developing countries benefit because they need finance to decarbonize their growth. They need to grow, which will require funds as well. But then at the same time, the emissions also need to be controlled. So through this mechanism, basically the developed countries are in a way financing the adoption of clean technologies in the developing countries, which helps to make it helps the growth of these developing countries, as well as the developed world benefits by financing and reducing the emissions overall at a planetary scale. And I think apart from this, the factors, the growth is also, I think, being driven right now by a lot of the action from various stakeholders. So in the past 12 to 18 months, companies have been asked to take up very ambitious climate goals. With the national level net zero targets being taken by countries within European Union, even India now has the net zero goal of 2070. So this national level action has been followed up by corporate level action, and companies are increasingly being asked by the stakeholders and especially the investor community to actually set up stringent goals around reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. And all of this has to be driven in part by the carbon markets as well, which have to provide those carbon credits which companies can use to meet these kind of stringent commitments. So all of this, I think, has been contributing towards the growth of these markets.
Right. Thank you so much, sir, for sharing your insights. I would now like to request Ms. Ashwini to address this question.
Sure, thanks. So essentially, like you said, carbon markets have grown extremely fast in the past couple of years. So let me just take a minute to also talk about why that is the case. Why are carbon markets so attractive? So carbon markets, like the professors from JNU and Professor Krishna Raj mentioned, are an economic instrument in order to incentivize emission reductions, because having a carbon price in the form of a tax or in the form of a sort of target in terms of a carbon market will essentially increase the price for manufacturers and industries in order to produce the same goods. So what they will do is they will try to reduce their costs, and in order to do that, they will reduce their emissions. So this is what drives emission reductions. So the way the carbon market is different from a carbon tax is that firstly, it is more politically feasible because taxes, as you all know, are extremely politically sensitive and electorally sensitive. That's why that is the first reason. The second is what happens in a carbon market is that the amount of reductions is more predictable, right? So what happens is instead of a command and control kind of a policy where the government goes around, tells everyone how much they should reduce. In a carbon market, they tell everyone how much to reduce, but they also have the option to trade. So what this does is that for the companies or for the countries where emission reductions are more expensive can meet certain part of their compliance target internally, but for the more expensive kind of reductions, they can buy it from others who can reduce at a more cheaper rate. So for example, iron and steel sector is a very energy intensive sector, but that's also because the processes are so energy intensive. You cannot just reduce emissions easily, and to change that you will have to reduce your entire technology, which is very expensive. Compared to that, a IT industry company might be able to do a lot more to reduce emissions. So a iron and steel company can buy credits from an iron and steel from an IT company this thing and reduce their emissions and meet their targets at a lower cost. So the cost efficiency is one important factor. And finally, the third important factor is these carbon markets, especially the compliance ones, have long-term targets. And that is one very critical element of it. So even PAT has 3-year cycles, and it has increasingly, now it has completed the 4th cycle. So there are long-term policy signals about where we need to reach. There are these national targets which also give people a sense of what is the overall ambition level, and therefore they know that there's going to be demand for these credits, which provides them with the confidence of continuing to reduce emissions. So that dynamic efficiency, which is continuing to reduce emissions over a period of time and not just one-off, that is the third point why carbon markets are so attractive. And that is the reason why the first carbon market that we saw, which is a cap and trade in the European Union, which is the EU ETS, it launched in 2005 and it covered about 5% of global GHGs. Today, carbon markets across the globe, including regional markets, subnational markets, national markets, they all cover almost 17% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So essentially, we are seeing a huge increase, and a lot of it has happened in the past couple of years. So like you mentioned, in 2020, despite the pandemic, we saw carbon markets flourish. So there are two parts to this. One is the value that you mentioned is a factor of, firstly, how much of carbon markets exist. So the size of the pie itself has increased. And the second is the prices have increased. And there are different reasons that are driving both of these. So when you look at the coverage with an already existing carbon markets from before, you have added China, which itself has about 4 billion tons of carbon dioxide coverage, and it covers 40% of China's emissions. So that is a new entrant. UK has introduced a national carbon market, and so has Germany. So these markets have come up in the last 2-3 years, and that is what has increased the entire size of pie. India is also looking at a national carbon market. Gujarat has, the state of Gujarat has declared that it is going to operationalize a cap and trade. So carbon markets are extremely attractive to countries, to subnational regions, for the reasons I mentioned. So that is one reason. The other is the prices have been increasing. And the reason for this is, the first is that countries are taking ambitious action, net zero targets across the globe. And increasingly, the demands of the Paris Agreement are that countries need to keep raising their ambition. So carbon markets receive that confidence on the demand for carbon credits that will continue to be there in the future. Second is the Article 6 rules, which Sandeep spoke about, which is, for the longest time, Article 6 rules were not yet finalized. In 2021, we finally adopted Article 6 rules, and with that clarity, again, gave a boost to carbon markets. And the third factor is the fact that a lot of these mature carbon markets, like the California cap and trade, like REGI, right, like EU ETS, which actually makes up 90% of all the transactions, all of these markets have been around for a while, and they've been strengthening their design and their caps and making them more robust and more stringent. In fact, EU ETS is going to undergo another major revision in the coming months, where they're going to add new sectors, they're going to revise the benchmarks. all of this is driving the prices. And the third and more sort of temporal aspect of it is also, of course, the geopolitical scene that we are seeing. So with Russia's tensions, already the natural gas prices were going up, which meant that Europe had to shift to fossil fuels, despite the fact that they had been decarbonizing. So they're essentially increasing emissions. So their need to reduce emissions has increased that much more. And that is what is creating more demand. So all of these factors are driving demand as well as additional markets. So both of these putting together, we have seen a huge boom in the compliance markets. And voluntary markets last year crossed 1 billion in transactions, the highest ever. Again, that is because apart from the action that countries are taking, companies have been taking net zero targets. So where will they reduce? A fossil fuel company at the end of the day is into fossil fuel. So how will they reduce it? They are going to buy credits. And this is where the demand comes from. And that is why even voluntary markets are sort of on the rise. What is also important is that the aspect of credibility that other professors and other panelists spoke about, which is also something that is being worked upon by the two different task forces that are looking at the integrity. And that will in fact also help increase the prices of voluntary offsets as well. So I'll just stop here. I know we are running over time, but that is just from my end. Thanks.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for sharing your insights. Again, for my next question, I would like to come back to you first. The economic crisis triggered by COVID-19 and Russia-Ukraine war, as you pointed out, have led to a global economic downturn with implications for climate action more specifically. So, will these tumultuous circumstances backtrack the mushrooming of carbon trading? You've sort of touched upon it, but let's just go into the details of this.
Right. So basically, any carbon market, even a well-designed carbon market, will witness economic shocks. So be it recession, pandemic, war, it will happen. So the question is, will it impact the carbon market? So yes, in the short term, it will impact carbon markets, but will that have a long-term impact on, like you said, the mushrooming of new carbon markets or stability of existing markets? This depends on two things. The first is the ability of the carbon market, both local markets as well as globally, to provide a clear, strong, long-term signal. So even if there are intermittent shocks, there needs to be a consistent signal that in the long run, there is going to be demand. And second is the ability of that market to absorb that shock or be resilient to the shock in the short term and sort of tide over it in the long term. So if we look at the pandemic, we would have expected the markets to crash like they did during the last recession. The EU ETS really sort of crashed at that time. But like I said, these markets have been around for a long time and they've actually evolved. And so there's more certainty around the emission reduction goals as well as the kind of design that it already has. So even though there was a dip during the pandemic in the interim, the economies and the demand in the economy picked up and so did carbon markets. In fact, at WRI, we did a voluntary carbon market simulation, which was a more research exercise, which included 21 large Indian companies to test out what design and implementation options can help India implement a successful carbon market. And this incidentally coincided with the global pandemic. So it was carried out in the year 2020. And what we saw essentially is, like I said, good design, including things like market stability reserves, which EU ETS has, or even implementing intensity-based targets like we did in our exercise, are some of the measures that have helped carbon markets sort of absorb these kinds of shocks. And these are the things that need to be considered even going ahead. But again, coming back to the war, what we are seeing so far is quite a mixed bag. What is working is at the moment the fact that there is still confidence that the commitments from countries are going to come in, they're going to be enhanced going forwards, as well as with regulatory front, Article 6 being ironed out increasingly. There is a confidence that will continue to make sure that the carbon markets don't really crash. But on the other hand, we also see that prices are rising a lot, which may seem like it's a good thing, but the reasons are really when you realize that it's not probably the best of scenarios. So the reason, like I mentioned, for the high prices is because the demand for fossil fuel has gone up, and the fact that this may also mean that even though the prices are rising because of the high demand of emission reductions, it may also happen that companies don't meet their targets and schemes like EU ETS don't end up achieving the emission reductions that they set out to achieve. So that is one big risk that we'll still have to wait and see. The other risk could be, we keep talking about carbon emissions and we keep talking about prices. The other important risk is to also remember that these prices on carbon, which the companies will have to bear, either in terms of buying credits or penalty if they don't meet their targets, will eventually be passed on to consumers or will affect their competitiveness when they sell goods. So for both of these, we need to be aware that this might impact poorer households, it might impact smaller businesses, and therefore policies which are probably outside the carbon market, but to compensate through direct transfers or even other incentives need to be undertaken to encourage clean energy sort of adoption and not going back to coal, which some countries have had to do in Europe. It's also important to ensure that the most poorest and the most smallest businesses and households are taken care of. And one last thing, of course, that will be at risk is, like I said, the fact that it can derail some of the emission reduction targets which countries have. And again, it comes back to the point that we assume that emission reductions and development are at loggerheads with each other, but that is not really the case. So the fact that fuel prices have spiked so much and that's affecting economies just goes to shows that energy security and economic security will come in when our countries actually decarbonize. And therefore, that is another risk that we need to be mindful of, and we need to ensure that increasingly our dependence on fossil fuels goes down, and therefore sort of tide over the war, the pandemic, and everything else. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I would now like to come to Mr. Keswani. So what are your thoughts on this?
Thanks, Nikar. So yeah, I think I agree with a lot of the points which Ashwini has put across. And definitely, I mean, when the Russia-Ukraine conflict first came to light, the carbon market prices declined significantly, and this was because of the expectation that companies will scale down operations. There'll be a depression in the economic crisis, and then hence the economy will suffer. Production of the companies will go down, emissions will go down, hence the demand for energy and these emissions will decline. But then, eventually this was overpowered by the fact that there was a boost in demand for fossil fuels. And, as Ashwini also just mentioned, that the demand for these fossil fuels like natural gas, coal, etc., the dependence on these fuels came back up, and that actually pushed up the carbon credit prices again. So all of these are, I think, factors which are impacting these markets in the short term. But really, I think these are short-term trends which will of course change day to day. But then, if you look at the longer-term projections for these markets and where they're heading, I think that's where we need to probably look at the fact that we do have very stringent goals when it comes to meeting net zero commitments. We do have sources of emissions which are unavoidable still. We don't have technological options available for a lot of the emission sources, or even if they're available, they are prohibitively expensive to implement. So in that case, we do need to fall back on our carbon markets to meet some of our commitments as well. So in the long term, of course, the demand is going to continue, but the way the market is going to get structured, I think, is also potentially going to change, because there are a lot of concerns around the credibility of the carbon markets. You would have heard various even multinational companies being sort of put under scrutiny for the kind of project that they have selected for use from a carbon offset perspective. So there are various initiatives being undertaken right now to reduce the concerns around greenwashing from the carbon market perspective. There are various stakeholder-led initiatives which are trying to develop stringent or sort of more robust mechanisms which will improve the credibility of these carbon markets and carbon market projects. So we expect that with the Article 6 getting operationalized in the exact modalities also coming out in the next few years, and even the voluntary carbon market expectations going to be sort of laid out more more clearly, then companies will actually have an idea about what kind of credits they would be able to buy, and there is a likelihood that these credits will be not as common as they are right now. Some of the credits which we are trading may not be eligible anymore, so which means that the pool of offsets that are available for us to trade may actually decline, and hence that may push up the carbon prices as well, because the supply may be limited. So all these factors are something which are actually playing right now in the background, and in the long term, all of these factors will actually eventually shape how the market moves in future. So there are a lot of factors here, and we definitely will have to wait and see how the larger picture emerges over time.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing your views, sir. This brings me to my next question for Professor Ramanathan. So, what are the concerns that could prevent the efficacy of carbon trading in reducing emissions, and what is required for a successful emissions trading scheme to fulfill this objective?
Yes, as I already told, that most of the scientists and all of us feel that there is always a distraction for the global leaders, because as you told that, as I told that hydrocarbons, which is needs to form millions of years, any geological resources like metals or gold, whatever you take, it takes millions of years, but extraction takes only a few years. So that is how we use these fossil fuels, and then there is always government policies of the different countries to distract these things, because one is that sometimes the Ukraine war will come, sometimes COVID will come. There will be some issues or other coming to each government, and already they have to use it. But ultimately, there is, as I told you, the trade-off should be there between because environment is a long term. The COVID may come for 5 years or 3 years, but the environmental things will be for hundreds of years, or even our 10 generations are going to bear this, what we are doing it now. So there somehow we have to have a balance between this present need and future needs, long-term needs. So everybody is addressing the present needs of 5 to 10 years. That is one thing. This is the concern. This carbon trading is one of the very important subsidies allowances to develop these, for example, degraded systems like degraded forest, degraded coastal ecosystem, degraded mining area. All these things, there's a thing. But only thing is that how far that is going to help this, because you cannot create the same biodiversity. For example, I disturb the mangrove. We think that mangrove is having only the 2 species, but we are having more than 30 species in Indian mangroves. In Himalayas, if you go, the tree line is shifting. That is a really concern for us, that the tree lines keep on shifting to the higher elevations. That means that we are losing the glaciers, because if you see the graph, even though after carbon trading 2005 onwards, we are talking about the carbon trading, but CO2 is increasing. That's how our Arctic and Antarctic and Greenland and our Himalayas, this water resource is a big concern for us, because water is the main resource which is going to remove the nutrients and put it into the soils. For example, the water coming from the Gangotri, which all the way transport the nutrients from up to Hooghly in the suspended saltation and traction mode. So it's not only carrying the silt and the clay, what we are feeling, the clay is having all these organic fatty acids and nutrients. That's why all your floodplains and other regions and deltas are fertile. If this system is going to be disturbed, that is going to because the water is not there, how the system is going to work? CO2 is keep on increasing, sea surface temperature is increasing, and the temperature is, and the air temperature is increasing. So that is the big concern. But the thing is that how can we stop this development? That is a big question that I don't have answer, but anybody don't have answer in this. But what is required for the successful emission trading scheme? That is the only thing that we can try to, we can adaptations and other things. So, for example, a lot of examples are there, that carbon positive villages. That is that I cannot say that the water is not, for example, the dispute between one state to other, water is not released by one river, one state to other river, one country to other country. What I have to do, I am supposed to do, I have to link it to the indigenous technology where the people have done. For example, the percolation tank, rainwater harvesting, and then watershed management. In that process, we are not only harvesting the water and increasing the groundwater, but we are also retaining the nutrients, and then making the soil more organic, and whatever the soil lost due to the erosion will be rebuilt in that regions. For example, in the coastal areas also. So the eco-hydrological systems, without the eco-hydrological systems, For example, in the Himalayas, the eco-hydrology system is controlled by the glaciers. Whereas in the Western Ghats and the peninsular India, example, that is controlled by the forest ecosystem. The forest is not only for the litters, for the organic carbon and everything, but for the water. The deeper the root penetrates, the deeper the water stores, deeper the springs comes, the deeper the first order stream comes, and then it becomes the second order and become the tributary, then the river system. So the indigenous knowledge and the indigenous peoples, that is what the one of the system that we should not, local community should not be affected, because we cannot take the advantage of them and then shift them from one place to another, rather than using them, their knowledge, in order to build how they lived 100 years back, 500 years back, because drought is there throughout the in several centuries in India, but people survived because the local knowledge in that one, they know where to get the water and which halophytes is having the deep roots, and we cut that deep root, we will get the water table. So the indigenous knowledge, the local community people should be encouraged, and then make the every villages and every city carbon positive using their own knowledge, and then which regenerate the lost, for example, soil organic carbon, and then the water lost in that one, and reduce the evaporations. In that recently there is an article comes down to below the solar panels. They are trying that you should have this goat and rearing is there, so that it will remove the weeds, and then it will enhance the vegetation, and then the cooling effect is there. So we have to look into the modern technology using the indigenous technology and the knowledge which are existing in the for example, in India, every state has its own traditional knowledge. So that has to be increased, so that they make them the carbon positive and don't depend upon. For example, already you told, the panelists told that there is no regularized market. Who will pay for this? And sometimes they may not buy also. The government also cannot put the green tax because people already polluted some of them. For example, mining industries are already contaminated the groundwater and the vegetation in the region. So if you don't put that and then penalize them, what will happen? That so the green tax is also an option, and also your carbon trading is also an option. So consider. So these are some of the options that we have to look into it, and then walk like you are walking in the rope below the knife. That is what is I can say that. So we should balance it and walk it so that the successful emission control can be achieved maybe in few decades.
Right. Thank you so much, sir, for answering this question. My next question is for Mr. Shailendra Singh Rao. This is basically related to what people have also been asking in the chat. So what is the size of India's carbon trading market? How does a carbon trading company typically work? And what are the factors driving its growth and some of the challenges that it could run into?
So to understand India's carbon market, we need to understand the global carbon market and its size and potential. So globally, in the past, there had been price slash, and that there were some crucial scenarios in carbon markets globally, wherein most of the carbon trading companies and carbon credits investors, they were not making money, and they were not able to sell their inventories completely. But in last 1.5 to 2 years, if we see the trend, there is a steep rise in the carbon credit prices. Globally, in 2021 itself, the voluntary carbon markets, if we see particularly, that hit a record high of USD 1 billion worth of trading in voluntary carbon markets, out of which in India itself, 300 million US dollar worth of trading had happened, which is still going on, and large number of carbon credits are being exported out of India. And India being world's second largest developer and supplier of carbon credits, India has that commanding position in the market, wherein India commands a very good number of inventory. Indian projects command a very good number of inventory, which can fulfill the supply of carbon credits globally. The carbon markets, Indian carbon market is going to cross more than 500 million US dollar by 2025, and it is poised to become $10 billion US dollar worth of industry in India itself. Within India itself, it is going to be 10 billion worth of industry by 2030. As per McKinsey report, the global carbon market is going to be 15-fold, that there's going to be a 15-fold growth by 2030 and by 100%, 100-fold growth by 2050. So that is the massive size of carbon market globally, and India has its fair share, and it's a long game in the market. That's what we see. Apart from this, as the question says, how does a carbon trading company work? Basically, a carbon trading company is majorly a consulting company, and as a carbon trading company, our company works in the carbon markets largely in India. And as a carbon credit services provider company, we basically originate the project, we find the project which are eligible to claim the carbon credits, and then we grab such project, we deal with the project owners, we sign the contracts, and we develop such project activities as per the voluntary or compliance market mechanism under whichever registry the project wants to get registered. By following the due processes and get it audited by the third-party auditors, request the registry for the issuance of credits, and then we source the buyers from international market for the trading of such carbon credits. And there is always a buyer-seller negotiation between the buyers and our project proponents, or sometimes directly with us, and we come to a fair price between both the parties. And then based on the agreements that we have signed, or based on the pre-approved and pre-agreed conditions between the buyer and the project proponent, or sometimes between buyer and us, based on the pre-agreed conditions, we are committed to supply them the desired number of credits. And that's how the monetary transactions also happen. So a carbon trading company is basically an end-to-end service provider, right from the project origination to the supply and monetization of carbon credits. There have been very good companies across India which are doing pretty well in the Indian carbon market, and there are some new startups coming in the carbon field as well. Innovation, if we talk about innovation in the carbon market, now carbon credits are going a step further, wherein carbon credits are now being truly digitized, decentralized, and democratized. And there has been a huge demand of such carbon credits from a section of investors across the globe, which are digitizing and tokenizing these carbon credits under the blockchain. Blockchain technology has its own advantages, wherein you are avoiding the double accounting of carbon credits, wherein once a carbon credit is on blockchain, that cannot be double offsetted or double accounted against a particular use or emission. As well as there have been large funds across the globe which are investing heavily in the carbon markets and converting these carbon credits in the exchange traded funds in terms of green bonds. So the use case for the carbon credits and the horizon, the overall horizon of carbon credits and advantages of carbon credit is increasing. Carbon credit right now is not just a tool for offsetting some parties' excess emission, but it has emerged as a very vast financial tool as well, which can be stored for a better future value amongst the investor circle. So that is one of the benefit where more and more companies are coming in and getting into this work. So factors deriving the growth of carbon markets, that there have been several factors. In Indian context only, if we see, India is one of the largest generator of renewable energy. India has a very vast forest cover as well. And above all, the awareness about the carbon credits and carbon markets, even our local farmers and agriculturists, they are being, continuously, they are being made aware about the agroforestry from which they can earn carbon credits. Industries have been earning out of it since ages, but now there have been efforts wherein indigenous people and the tribal people, they are being aware, being made aware of the benefits out of the carbon credit. large community development projects which are happening. So looking at these things, the benefit of such carbon credits and carbon markets can reach to the grassroots level people as well, which can give a huge boost to the Indian carbon market globally as well. India is coming up with its own carbon credits market, regional market, since Gujarat has recently announced the building of its within the state, it's a state carbon market. So these kind of activities and efforts which government and Indian government and state governments are doing, I guess this is going to increase the better supply of the carbon credits from quality projects. And apart from this, we hope for a better pricing of carbon credits, because there'll be a healthy competition between the project investors as well. And I guess the demand and supply both will be monitored by continuously by putting in such regulatory mechanisms and efforts by the government. So these are the positive sides, but there have been some factors which are affecting it as well. So there have been some projects which has large number of carbon credits, but they are not priced in a better manner. So such kind of things, they spread the negativity about the overall market and the overall environment. Taxation is also one of the prime concerns, because there has been an uncertainty about the tax on carbon credits income. So that is one of the major concern for all the investors these days, because income from carbon, there is a huge demand from a particular section of carbon credit investors, that the income generated from carbon credit needs to be tax free. So taxation part is also there. The technological disadvantages, because in India we are still way behind in terms of climate friendly and environment friendly technologies. We do not yet have such access the carbon storage and the carbon capture technologies, and the better renewable energy generation efficient technologies. So such technological access that we do not have these days. So that could also be one of the disadvantage. We are not able to harness the full potential of Indian carbon market. If we are having a better mechanism in place, I guess India can surpass China in terms of supply of carbon credits, and we can become the global leader already.
Right. Thank you so much, sir, for your inputs. On this note, I would like to bring in Ms. Advocate Vanita Bhargav. She's a partner in Khaitan and Company and also an advocate on record in Supreme Court. Ma'am, as you know, the center is considering a change in legislation for implementing the carbon trading scheme that will subsume the present tradable certificates. What are some of the core issues that this policy must address in a way that promotes India as a global hotspot for carbon trade?
Thank you, Nikhar. Firstly, for inviting me to be a part of this panel and giving me the opportunity to gain from my esteemed panelists' views. So as has been discussed earlier, trading of carbon emissions or carbon credits has become the world's biggest commodity market. So it's basically a commodity. So currently, carbon credit in India is traded on exchanges as a future contract, and future contracts are was governed by the Forward Contracts Regulation Act 1952 and Indian Contract Act, but by Finance Act 2015, Forward Contracts Act was repealed, and now carbon credits basically regulated by SEBI, the trading of carbon credits. Now, as it has been discussed earlier, carbon markets exist both under the mandatory compliance schemes and voluntary programs. India originated carbon credits mostly currently trade on voluntary international markets. But as it has been mentioned by the panelists earlier also, such markets lack the regulation and transparency requirements. And with the exponential growth of any market, need for regulation becomes imperative to maintain the integrity, as was mentioned by Ashwini as well. So the present schemes are very limited, as buyers are limited. And as mentioned by Shailendra, buyers are those who voluntarily want to reduce emissions. And it's very bilateral driven market. So once India opens a formal carbon trading market, and sort of there's a conversion factor for every certificate into how much CO2 has been avoided. So market will become very large. and market determined price would, in the future reflect the true picture. So the core issues that must be kept in mind while implementing, this welcome step of formulating a carbon trading scheme. So firstly, there should be clear definitions of carbon credits, nature-based solutions. Various acronyms have been used in the Paris Agreement, Kyoto Protocol. They should be explained to remove ambiguity. Carbon standards should be laid down. Their certification, methodologies of certification, and benefit sharing ought to be laid down clearly. Some help can be taken from the domestic legislation on standards already in place. Technical issues of allocations and surpluses of or oversupply, as was mentioned by Shrendra, liquidity, windfall profits, for example, what is happening in Ukraine, and offset arbitrage, as well as issues relating to in carbon leakage. That all these issues will have to be addressed. And oversupply needs to be addressed because it removes the incentive for taking action to meet the caps imposed. Then there should be focus on how carbon credits are accounted for, and again, as we mentioned, the reliable carbon standards and uniform carbon standards for determining high quality credit. Then there should also be a focus on how project benefits are determined and shared. Like Professor Ramanathan mentioned, the role of local communities in managing carbon stocks. So there should be proper regulation so as to so that they can also benefit from the carbon credit. Then there is the problem of greenwashing, as was mentioned. So some of the sources of carbon trading could be scams. For example, tree planting. Permanent reforestation is a one-time reduction of carbon, and they can't be used again and again. And there should be regulation to prevent fake credits being used. So if the sellers are regulated and monitored, it would attract buyers and open new markets. Therefore, there should be focus on development of new certification methodologies for nature-based solutions, especially. Then the type of certificates we know, our carbon credit certificates, voluntary emission reductions, and certified emission reductions. So while carbon credits and voluntary emission reduction certificates are often certified, but the certification is voluntary and involves a wide range of bodies and different quality standards that are not recognized in certain jurisdictions. So that limits the market. So, and currently, due to present legislation, purchases from Europe are not allowed to access the Indian market. So in order to leverage the market, these issues should be addressed, that there should be a standard. And as mentioned before, India lacks an explicit policy pricing on carbon, or a market-based scheme, or a cap and trade mechanism. And as mentioned by Shrendra, carbon pricing is an issue because of bilateral nature of the trade, and it brings volatility. So currently carbon pricing is, as has been mentioned, it is determined by implicit mechanisms such as PAT, where energy saving certificates are traded, and the renewable energy certificates trading scheme. So as discussed, cap and trade mechanism is a market-based system where government sets a cap on emissions and allows industries to buy and sell permits to stay below the cap. And in June 2019, pilot program was initiated in Gujarat, as has been mentioned, in Surat, and but that was for particulate matter, and it has reduced emissions by 24% with little cost of industry. So it has been a success. But the government, from what the government from the newspaper reports, we've seen the government proposes to begin with a voluntary market scheme, as opposed to cap and trade or compliance market scheme. But yes, there would be a gradual shift. It is ideal that there should be a gradual shift to cap and trade system as well. And why that is so? Because like I think it was mentioned by Ashwini, that compliance market credits, although they may be purchased by, in the voluntary, like compliance market credits may be purchased by voluntary non-regulated entities. But unless they're explicitly accepted into the compliance regime, they don't fulfill the compliance market demand. And that is why compliance market schemes are priced higher. So in order to get the right price, also the roadmap for transition from voluntary market to compliance market scheme has to be chalked out. Also one advantage of of cap and trade would be that it helps domestic compliance, and once a carbon pricing policy is established, it can be linked to emission trading schemes of other jurisdictions and develop a common crediting mechanism that can boost exports. So linking compatible emissions trading systems with each other enables participants in one system to use units from another system for compliance purposes. And as mentioned by Professor Ramanathan, what is to be kept in mind is that carbon trading is a supplementary and temporary measure for reducing emissions. It is not a permanent solution. It's okay, it's commoditized, but what is to be ensured is that large emitters do not use the scheme, for cheap carbon credit. So in COP26, parties to the Paris Agreement finally agreed on the rule book for Article 6, determining how carbon credits can be used and traded under the agreement. And under the new Article 6, governments will be responsible for determining which carbon credits are authorized for mitigation. So the price, yes.
Sorry to interrupt. We are kind of running out of time. So
Sure.
I would request you to take up the last question also. That which are the countries that India can take inspiration from? We will wrap up in another 2-3 minutes then.
Absolutely. I covered that these are the main points, basically, that the government should, and they could be establishment of carbon auctions and trading platforms. They should encourage long-term investment in CDM projects, both public and private sector. And carbon credits from different sources also should be dealt with separately. And of course, procedural aspects should be taken care of to ease carbon trading, and to make people more aware how to, because there are many questions on how carbon trading is done. And even on digitization and use of blockchain technology, as mentioned by Shilendra, it would need proper regulation. As far as other jurisdictions from which India can, be inspired, one is the California Quebec Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative of US and EU cap and trade markets, which has set a cap, safeguards against price spikes, and a mix of allocations and auctions of permits to help industries make the transition, information and analysis from European and California's ETS system, which shows that the administrative cost of creating ETS is very low. Then the EU emissions trading system has been talked about. It was the world's first major carbon market and remains the biggest one. This mechanism is shown to be very effective because it provides certainty about maximum quantity of GHG emissions, etc. And as has been mentioned, this anyways, is used as a benchmark for voluntary market credits already. And EU ETS legislation, it also provides for the possibility to link the emission trading scheme with other compatible emissions trading systems in the world. So following this EU ETS, there are many other countries like New Zealand, Australia, California, who have introduced such schemes. Then carbon trading in China, as was touched upon. China introduced its national emissions trading system on 16 July 2021, but it only covers the power generation sector. Unlike the EU ETS, China's allocation of emissions allowances is not decided upfront via an absolute cap, but is based instead on emissions intensity. So it follows a bottoms-up approach by which the covered companies are allocated their emission allowances free of charge. This allocation is based on a national benchmarking method, whereby the average carbon intensity of key sectors and products is calculated and compared with that of individual emitters. Now, the companies which are able to reduce carbon intensity of the production can generate a surplus allowance to sell. So the allowance price is dynamic and varies daily. As was said, that India does not have an explicit imposition of carbon tax. Imposing carbon tax would mean that there would be a predefined price on carbon pollution, thereby pushing businesses towards clean energy. Carbon tax was first imposed by Finland, and carbon taxes have been levied in Chile, Estonia, Finland, France, Iceland, Ireland. Sweden currently has, follows a scheme of carbon tax, which is the highest carbon price. So these are some of the jurisdiction, I think, from which India can gain some experience. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, ma'am, for answering it so precisely. I would like to thank all the panelists for joining this discussion, as well as all the audience. We have quite a few questions from the audience. I would request them to drop those queries at editorial@tpci.in. I will share them with the panel, and we can share the answers with you, because we are really running out of time today. So thank you so much once again for joining this discussion, and we hope it was as insightful for you all as it was for us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Good evening. Bye for the day.